Hello, and welcome to the Mission Critical podcast. I am Taylor Anstey, and as always, I am joined by Lead 555 founder Mark Warr. Our goal here at L5 is to help catalytic leaders tackle big systemic problems together in community. And today on our podcast, we are going to be tackling the concept of leadership structure in the church. And for you, Mark, leadership has been something that has been kind of at the forefront of, I would say, your whole life. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But as I kind of am listening to you talk about these sorts of things, there have been some shifts in maybe how you view these things. So as we dive into this conversation, can you just kind of give us some context for this discussion around leadership structure in the church?
Yeah, certainly. It's something close to my heart. My father taught me the importance of leadership, and since I was an early teen, or even before my teens, I remember having discussions with my dad, and he spent much of his life focusing on leadership development in Brazil on the mission field as a missionary. And so I grew up with this sort of keen sensitivity to the importance of leadership. And much of it was leadership in the context of tasks, of organizations, of NGOs, of getting things done. And so it's interesting, as I've, lived another 30, 40 years since that time, as I've wrestled with this concept of leadership, the idea of leadership in the church has really, in some ways, caught me off guard. I never challenged it or assumed it a lot, or assumed. I assumed what it was, and I didn't really think about it. And as I go back now to thinking about it and rereading scripture and sort of putting on some new lenses, God's been sort of challenging me about a lot of my basic assumptions of what scripture really says and so on. I'm realizing that there's a lot of leadership principles that are applicable universally everywhere, but then there's some in in the context of a spiritual community of God's people that are different. And I think one of the problems is that as the church has sort of, in some ways evolved, or at least the practice of church has evolved over hundreds and even thousand plus 2000 years, we've grown more and more toward this um, very sort of managerial form of church leadership. And so that's some of the basis for this. I think there's some things that we're missing that are absolutely critical to having an effective role as a leader in a church context. So that's where I started from. And as you say, my thoughts are shifting and growing. I hope I'm not, um, you know, it isn't that we sort of say, okay, that 10 years was rubbish, and now I'm going to try to figure out something new. Sometimes that happens in our lives. And there's a few things that I think I got totally wrong. And so I sort of have to rethink it. But I think this is one that we have to allow ourselves, pastors, other leaders, and just disciples of Jesus in general need to be asking themselves this because you're somewhere in the mix, right? You're either a leader or a follower or a helper. You're part of this. You're being led or you're leading one way or another. And so it's an important question.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the blog post that you have written kind of around this subject, you've kind of outlined a few different things for us that are important to know. And one of those things is kind of where these leaders come from. And so I want to read this very short quote from what you have written. It says, "Choosing leaders from afar preempts the true maturing of the body." And that's a bold statement. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. How does choosing leaders from afar, and maybe even explain that, because people might not even get what that means. But how does that kind of preempt the true maturing of the church?
Yeah, it is a bold statement, and I'm um, I feel comfortable making it. um, and with any bold statement, there's always, there's some exceptions and there's some sort of debate about it and so on. That's why it's bold. And it's meant to be bold to get us talking about something that's very important. Um, I think we need to go back to a couple of things to answer that question. First of all, is where do Christian communities come from? That's a question that probably most people, most Christians have never answered because most of us assume that if we're an unbeliever and we come into the kingdom, then we're going to find the nearest local church that usually has four walls and we're going to join it. And when in reality, in some ways, it's a lot simpler than that. And we've sort of created these literal walls and other boxes around ourselves to think of church in a certain way. So let's back up and look at it. In its, stripping everything else apart. So somebody comes to Christ. They answer the call to the gospel of the kingdom, the good news that there is a kingdom with a new king. And to meet this new king, you need to have faith. You have faith in Jesus, and you're able to join with all that that means. So you join this kingdom. And when you do that, you're a new person. You're reborn. So many things change. And when we're come into that kingdom, there's a reminder as we start to learn about what the culture of that kingdom is to come together, to meet up with others. So you look for other believers, and you may already know some, or you maybe don't, and you're going to go down the street or across town. Most likely, you came to Christ because somebody helped you, led you along that process. And if that was the case, you probably have a contact in that community already. So Christians find each other and they gather together. And as they gather together, some amazing things start to happen. They're taught maybe by apostolic workers, people who have the gift of teaching and help us get sort of the basis and the basics of the truth and help us learn how to study the word and so on. And we begin to do things like pray together. We worship together because we have a new king in this kingdom that we worship. And we realize that there's a culture to it. So we start living differently and we start loving each other in a whole new way. But we don't stop there. We don't just love God and love each other. We love our neighbors and we change how we act around them. And we do things in a just way and in an honest way instead of sort of the way of the world that tries to get away with whatever it can usually. And so when we do that, there's not just a metaphorical, but a supernatural connection that happens between those people. They're actually a type of ligament called the spirit that lives in us and connects us to each other and helps us to love one another and helps us to pray and helps us to connect with our Lord. And so when that happens, it's something so remarkable that the world stands up and takes notice and says, that is not normal. What's going on with these people? Because they witness in our community something beautiful. And it touches their heart because I believe every human being is drawn to that kind of beauty. Okay. That's the context. Now, into that context, what kind of leadership do we want? What kind of leadership is appropriate in that context where we have an organism that's come together, right? Because Jesus says the church is his body. Another word he uses is the church is a family, right? We're a family. We're brothers and sisters when we come together. So imagine a young couple, they get married, they have very little experience in marriage or kids or anything like that, but soon enough, they have a baby. Okay. Now they're a father and a mother and they have a baby. Do they have experience with that? No. When we had our children, it was amazing. It's like, how can our creator trust us with no experience to take this tiny little, incredibly fragile human being that weighs, 3 kilos or 4 kilos, and 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 take care of them. It's a phenomenal responsibility. But parents from the beginning of time have been trusted with this responsibility to raise this child. And there's something in them that enables them to do that. There's a natural love of a mother and the wisdom of a father and so on, and the protection of a father to do that. Okay. Now imagine if people said, um, that couple, they haven't had any babies yet. They have no experience. They actually need about 5 years experience with kids before they can be trusted to be parents. So the grandparents are going to step in, or maybe we'll go and find a good parent who's had success with their own children, and we're going to give them care over their children. And they're going to model and teach and mentor and coach and all of that until, when they decide that the parents are well off enough or understand and have the experience, then they're going to give the children back to the parents. Um, that's absurd, obviously, right? And yet that's what we do with this beautiful little family that has come together to be the people of God in community. And we go and hire a father to come in and take over because we don't know how to do it, or it's just the way things are done, or my denomination requires that of us. And that person has to have a degree and pass certain credentials and all of this kind of stuff to fulfill that role, as a hired gun in a sense, to bring in to the community to set it straight or lead it or take it over or run it or whatever. I think it's important to go back to the original beginnings of what that kind of community is. And that starts to set us on the right path toward what kind of leadership. Leadership is organic. God promised that He would give us the Spirit to enable us in all things, including teaching and leadership and helping and serving and praying and crying together and having compassion for one another and having the insights that we need in the world. It's a transforming process in our lives and in our collective community that goes on by the work of the Spirit in us. Um, so that's sort of the feeling, the beginning point for me is okay, you know, hiring a pastor from 1,000 miles away, you put it on a human resource website or something where pastors put their resumes, and you look for the perfect match between a church and a pastor, and you have interviews. It's a very HR, human resource sort of approach, a businessy approach, and yeah, you can get good people that way. I'm not saying that those aren't good people with the best of motives. Okay. Don't get me wrong. Okay. There's been many beautiful communities that have come together that way, but I don't think it matches the the true quality and identity of what the church is. And so that's why I feel it's important to begin to call that out. Now, there's lots of challenges. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't just happen beautifully. Imagine the young parents with a new baby. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to feel insecure. Uh, I've made plenty of them myself. Some of your children grow up almost perfect. Others are disasters. You know, it, it there's fighting and squabbling. At some point when they turn 12 to 13, their attitudes change and they get a little bit snappy, and you know they're sort of testing their wings. All these things happen in families. They're a beautiful part of the process of the ups and downs in families. And that's what a church is. It's not meant to be perfect. We don't have it all figured out, but we have to trust that God knows what He's up to when He says, come and gather together, and I'm going to give you your Spirit, and I'm going to help you. That's my parting shot.
No, I've never heard it that way with the analogy of the family. It really kind of illuminates your point because like you said, I would never expect, grandparents to take care of kids for the first 5 years and then have them
Right.
returned. Um, it really kind of strips away a lot of the added things that we put on there. Yeah, so for context, which context is pretty important in this case. So I am a pastor who recently has done this very thing that you are discussing. And I personally feel that tension of, okay, I have the education. I am that person that would kind of be hired from afar into one of these situations. So I myself, the world that we live in, the culture, everything has kind of been set up in a way that that's how things run. But in the same breath, you, me, many others recognize that, this is not really necessarily what the Bible teaches. So, yeah, give us just your personal thoughts. Like, what would be kind of the first step or a roadmap? Like, how do we get out of this mess that's kind of been around for centuries? Small question.
Yeah, yeah. Small, big question. It's yeah. Many people accuse me, probably rightly so, of being maybe a bit too bold and sort of radical. But I think it's radical change that is needed. Now, radical change doesn't mean necessarily abrupt change. Okay, radical is a significant change, but there is a process to do that, and it matters that we don't forget that even that process of change, we do it in love, we do it with compassion, we use the best of our abilities as leaders and managers and so on to try to smooth the process in that. Okay, so yes, let's hold on to the ideals, but then let's use our minds to do the very best job we can to help lead a community in that direction. So we live in a system where the absolutely dominant model of church leadership is leaders from outside. Rarely do you see pastors hired from within. I'm sure it happens, and it's basically we're going to go hunting for a pastor. We live in that. And as you said, you're one of those people. And I go to a church where, I've gone to churches all my life where that's the way it was done. So how do we, if you want to change, how do you do it? I think the first step is to just acknowledge it. Just say, yeah, we got a problem here. Okay. It's works. It works to some degree, absolutely. But it doesn't match up with that beautiful family uh, uh, picture that God has of the church. So how can we get back to that? Let's admit that there's a problem and commit to be a part of the solution. And then we ask ourselves, what are a couple of other things that we can do? I think if we start with that, that's all you can do at the beginning. There's some places. Let me throw this in right now. There's some places or some churches, I believe, that aren't at the space or time where you can even start. Okay. There has to be a core of people, like a bit of evidence that the spirit is challenging at a deeper level, and the community says we're missing something here, and they start to listen. Right. Um, if you don't have that at all, I think to come in and try to create the change is going to end up, even if you're not trying to, it's going to look abrupt and it's going to lead to all kinds of broken relationships and
Yeah.
pain and so on. Okay. So I'm not saying that this has to happen right now, everywhere, instantly. Not at all. But if God is even getting you to think about this podcast or you've read another book that's challenging you in this area, then maybe God is also doing the same with other people in your church, and you have a starting point then. I think the other two things, there's a couple of things here that I'll throw in. Once you make a commitment to that, then uh, do what I would call as a commitment to shared leadership. So you are that hired pastor from outside. You're coming in, you're living in that system. You see a problem with it. You're not going to resign. You could, but you're probably not going to resign. You don't need to resign because you're working in that system still, but you agree, you make a commitment yourself to share leadership. You aren't the pastor. It doesn't matter what the people call you senior pastor, reverend, father, bishop, what, it doesn't matter what they call you. What you are is a servant who wants to find other leaders and share leadership in the community, because I believe that in every community of, you know, 20, 30, 40 people, you're going to see multiple leaders in that community. Some are going to be, uh, you know, barely 13 and have very little life experience, but you see the potential there. Some are going to be, you know, successful already in the business world, and you just need to help them develop it in the spiritual context or whatever it might be. How do you share leadership and develop other people? And to do that, if you have an attitude that you are occupying the space of leadership, you are the leader and you occupy that space, you're going to have a very hard time getting people to step forward because there's no space for them. You occupy it, and you might play the game of developing leaders, but when they want to lead or step into that space, you push back because it's your space. It's your job description. You are paid to do it, and you have to be faithful to it. If that's your attitude, you're going to have a very hard time doing this kind of leadership development. So you need to sort of step out of that space, and that space becomes very broad, and you invite people into that leadership space where you share it. In a sense, you're mentoring and coaching people in leadership. And a good servant leader will be able to take people that are very reticent or shy or scared to step into that, but you see potential in them, and you'll be able to sort of subtly get them into taking on roles, um, and after a little while they realize they're doing it. Okay, so there's lots of techniques there that you can use to do that, but a commitment to shared leadership is one of those. Saying shared leadership really fast can sometimes be a tongue twister, but I need to find a different way to say that. The third point is what I would call a facilitative model, um, and this is similar to number two, but it's understanding that you're not just developing other leaders, but you're developing other facilitative leaders and modeling it for them. A facilitative leader is one that sort of has a bit of an attitude shift. Instead of using the resources of the church, you might make them feel good, pat them on the back and stuff, but what you really want is them to come to church, make the church look full, give the church their money so that the church, under your leadership as the chief executive officer, can go out and do the programs of the church. Okay. That too often that's how things work. And you want to turn it upside down and create an attitude shift where you are facilitating, you're behind, you're not in front, you're behind, enabling the work of the church to happen through the people, and to nurture that and make sure that every gift and talent that the people have is matched to what they're doing, and is being celebrated. They find their place. There's one little comment there. What I've just said, I think, is correct, but it needs to be balanced with the idea that church community isn't defined by what they go out and do. Now, churches do together go out and do things, but like a family, the core of it, before you go out and do anything, is the identity. It's the belonging, right? We're a family, we belong, we're together, we're organic. And in that organism is the love and the connections and the relationships and the countercultural things that go on that just bewilder the world and make them ask, what's really going on here? So that comes first, and then the going out together. So I just wanted to make sure that we're not saying we're churches are a task oriented sort of organization that need to work together as a fine tuned team. I think team is not a bad metaphor for how we should function in a church, but it's not a very complete one. Okay. So those are some ways to start if you're one of those pastors who's been brought into a church. I think you can be instrumental to bring about this change. But here's where it gets tricky. If you're successful in doing that, it means that you're the last in a long line of pastors that have got there that old way, right? That's a sign of success. You're the last one. And you're training a community of leaders that rise up from within. And I think that's why my first point, make the commitment, see the problem and commit to do something about it, is so important. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to be thinking about yourself saying, oh my goodness, if I'm successful with this, I might lose my job or they won't need me anymore. Right. Um, there's actually some real benefits in this approach in terms of let's say funding, budgets, and all this kind of thing. Because in its sort of pure ideal um, expression, you don't need to pay anyone to do this. Okay. I know that's a bit extreme and maybe that's down the road. Uh, but there's so many implications, I think, that are positive if we start to see that kind of change.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate, sometimes when I'm listening to things, I like to see it all in a nice, neat package. So let me summarize a little bit before going to my next question. Kind of the three main points that you brought up around the idea of leadership structure are: number one, that kingdom community leaders should come from within the community. The second one is that church leadership is multiple and shared. And the last one is that church leadership is facilitative, not directive. And so I want to jump back a little bit to the kind of second point for a second. And this would be something that you practice on a regular basis, leaders developing other leaders. That is a beautiful model. I think, many pastors would say that they would hope to do that. And many Christians would say, they would hope to do that in the sense of making disciples. But I think if we take a good, honest look at ourselves, the stats on people that actually are able to do this are probably a little bit low. So if I was to say to you, Mark, how do I start developing other leaders? As a leader myself, how do I become someone who develops others? You can speak to this in a pastoral context or in a general context. How do we start this? What would be the first steps to kind of becoming a leader that raises up those other leaders?
Yeah, I thought about this a bit, and I get that it's hard, and and we know it's hard because it doesn't happen. But is it really hard? Okay, and I'm going to push back on that a bit and
Yeah.
say it's hard to start without having a model. But if we
Mm,
were doing this from generation to generation, it wouldn't be so hard
right.
because we were developed that way and we develop another person that way and we keep modeling and passing on and doing what we taught. A good father is probably a good father, not all the time, but because they had some father mentors, role models in their life. They've seen a good father and they say that's the kind of person I want to be. And I think in church leadership, it's actually simpler than it sounds, but it looks sort of mystifying because we have so few examples of it happening. And what makes that harder then? So that's one point. The other point is that the only model of church leadership that many people have, I would say most people have, is the traditional one that involves a very complicated professional process of, you know, career choices, training, it's like becoming a lawyer, right? You go to school and then you have to do a bunch of other things after you're done in school and whatever the
Yeah.
terms are. Pastors need to get credentialed or they need to pass different tests or exams and interviews and all of that. I mean, it is daunting. Who in their right mind, unless that was their primary career, wants to step into that? So they're going to say, wait, no, I don't want to do that. And the pastor doesn't want to mentor someone into that because unless they're, you know, the very unusual few that are called to that kind of ministry. Um, so we make it very hard on ourselves by the assumptions that we sort of package together with that. So if we had a role model, the best one is who trained us, right? So if we're a second generation of this kind of model, that's step one. Second is to redefine what leadership is in a local church. And I'm saying it can be a lot more fun and natural and empowered by the Spirit than our current models make it. And so if we get those things right, then I don't think it's that hard. The question is more, how do you get that first generation, right?
Hmm.
That's how do you start when there's sort of nothing to start with, and that's a challenge. I don't know all the answers to that. I what I do know is that it does happen in some places, and we need to find those stories and
Hmm.
tell those stories and listen to those people. Um, and that's something that maybe we as an organization might do sometimes is find those stories where the people are living this way, and then that
Hmm.
becomes the inspiration for that sort of first new generation. Um, so it's tough, but it's doable, and we need to start somewhere.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, you take the first step, you fall, you get back up, you try again. That's kind of the way it goes when you're doing I guess something that's new or different than maybe the way that we were raised in the church. So let's track this a little bit further down the line. I mean, let's say, you know, you're in a church, you're trying to implement these changes, you're trying to raise up other leaders and do all of these sort of things that you're proposing. And maybe you can speak personally to this or maybe more generally, but when you try to do that, there is going to be opposition. You know, I've seen, I mean, I've probably come up against with some opposing thoughts. I've seen, you know, family members, you know, people all around kind of be like, I don't know if this is right. How do we prepare for this sort of opposition? Because it's going to come. As humans, we resist change. We don't like that. And sometimes our backs get up and sometimes, you know, we challenge and Mark, you always invite those challenges, which is awesome. But how do we prepare for that opposition and because it's going to come. So as you know, for someone who wants to step into this, you know, how do you take on the opposition that comes?
Yeah, I like I said earlier, I think there's some churches that aren't ready to start, and I think we need to discern where those are and just sort of walk by and pray for them. If you care about them, pray for them that God would ignite something somewhere. So let's keep that in mind. But I think we're talking about starting with trying to find the fertile ground. And there's enough of those to give all of us plenty of work to do. And if there's fertile ground, then there's already people there. I believe God's placed people there, and they just need a bit of guidance and direction, maybe some validation, some encouragement that it's okay, a few rails to run on. And we hope things like this podcast give people a bit of encouragement to take those steps. So that's part of it. I think in my experience, and I'll just use an example. I was part of a church that um, had a situation where the worship leader um, was many years in the church and grew up most of his life in the church and was very committed and did a phenomenal job of every day being faithful to leading the worship. Um, and sadly, he passed away. Uh, earlier in his life, and God took him home. And there was a lot of course, sadness around his passing. And then the next question was, what are we going to do about worship? And we said, you know, there's people that can sing, can play instruments, can lead us in many different ways. Not that that's the only way to worship, through music, but that's one of the favorite ways that we have to worship. And there's people that can do that. And so for a while, the attitude was, okay, yeah, we'll fill in. We'll take care of that. So there was a handful of people that stepped up, that had never stepped up before, or had very, very occasionally stepped up and said, we'll do this. And then once in a while, the question would come back. So when are we going to, get a new worship leader? Someone who's professionally trained and sort of gets paid to do this. And I started to, I would gently say, we're doing it. We're doing it. This is the gifting God has given you, and this is the space, the opportunity that you can step into. And then they started to see it. Okay. And since then, they've blossomed. They've taken leadership in that area. Other people have got involved, and they're fulfilling the talents and gifts that the Spirit has given them that they weren't before. Partly because they weren't given the space to do it, partly because they didn't realize uh, that they could or should exercise those gifts. Maybe they weren't needed because somebody else was already doing it. So it goes back to my earlier point of stepping outside of the center of that space and allowing other people to come in. Now, if we'd come to those people when our worship leader was still living and said, we would like you all to step up and start taking turns at that, um, they would have resisted and said, no, we're already paying him to do the job. Um, if I'd gone too far after, when they stepped up and said, no, you need to do it all the time from now on, they may have resisted and said, wait a minute, I didn't know what I was getting into, but we gave them time, and then affirmation and support, and a little bit of training here and there, getting someone to talk about, the sound system and all that stuff. And slowly they were able to do it themselves. So there's a process of that. But we don't want someone to pass away to open up the space. In this case, that's sort of how it happened. But we want leaders to intentionally open up space and then gently get people involved. And I think that deals with the opposition most of the time. Now, there's still going to be some opposition. There'll always be people sort of on the sidelines complaining and wanting to go back to the nostalgic old ways. Okay. There's always going to be a few people like that. And hopefully we win them over eventually as we see people come to life. What we've seen in that situation I just described is that people are more excited than ever about serving because the professionals were no longer occupying that space. Now, that was in the context of worship. Imagine what happens when a senior pastor steps out. And I think that's where there's been some very good examples and some bad ones, where when the senior pastor leaves and there's what people would call a vacancy, right? We're without a pastor, which I don't think is accurate at all. God has gifted people in your community to be the shepherds. They're already there. You just don't recognize them because the system doesn't see them. Um, but when people do that, you can either complain and fall apart, or you can step up. And I think God wants us to step up in these communities. So yeah, it's the pushback, I think it can either mean they're not ready, or it can mean maybe we're pushing a little too hard, too fast, or they don't understand the process yet. But when you give people, what I've found was when you give people a little bit of faith, right, a little bit of belief in who they are, and that they can step up, and that's where leadership from behind can happen. And the beautiful thing there is that um, I would say that in most church communities, let's say the professionals leave or they resign or they take another job somewhere, they get out of the way. Um, there's leadership in the church. There's still leadership in the church. And if that leadership can start to adopt some of this kind of attitude change about leadership, they can be creating the environment, the safe environment for leaders from within. So my dream is that churches would increasingly get to the point, the church council, board of elders, or whatever you call the leadership structure in your church, that they would get to the point where when the pastor leaves, it isn't automatically okay. We need to write up a job description and advertise all over the world for another pastor because we need one. My dream is that people would stop and think and say, is that what we want to do? Maybe they still want to do that. Or is there another way? And is there some good arguments for that other way? And we hope that this podcast gets you at least thinking that, you know what? It might be even far better that we not hire a new pastor and that we learn to be a family in a way that thrives, becomes a beautiful witness to the world.
Yeah, awesome. Some really great points there around all of those ideas. We're kind of running out of time, so I want to just ask you one more question. Um, I've read that you've said, and you've probably said it to me as well, that the current model that we're in is unsustainable, that we can't continue this way into the future. And I would agree with that statement, but if we look throughout history for hundreds of years, this model has kind of been able to sustain itself. So, um, yeah, what has changed? What has happened now in the 21st century that has now made this model that we've operated in for so long unsustainable?
I love that you put that question in there because it's anticipating what other people are going to say when they read this and listen. They go, wait a minute. There's a lot of success stories around here. I mean, hasn't the gospel gone from the early days to almost every corner of the entire world? Isn't that success? So what are you complaining about, Mark? Right? It's a good question, and I am still learning about that. But there's a couple of key points I want us to consider. One is that as long as there's been a frontier, okay, a frontier is that like sort of like that that front line of expansion. Okay, so the gospel started uh, in Israel, and it spread to the surrounding nations, and particularly going west to Turkey and Greece and Italy and into Europe. And in each of those places, every few years, the frontier kept moving. And then eventually it crossed the world over to North America. Some of it went south into Ethiopia and farther and into India and so on, and sort of circled back. And so for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe since, basically the last 2,000 years, we've had this moving frontier. And there's a few little places, not little in an insignificant way, but there's a few places that are shrinking, thankfully, that have not heard the gospel at all. And so we're going to those places still, and there's great um, uh, apostles and prophets and missionaries and so on that are doing that good work. But the frontier is shrinking. It's not there like it used to be. And what you find is that it's a bit like a wave. The front of the wave comes in, and it generally has come into parts of the world that had what, let's call it a belief in the supernatural. Okay. So there was this kind of thing that when you talked about God, it made sense to them. They believed in a different God or gods or spirits or whatever, but you were talking a similar language. And the gospel has spread around the world in those kind of places. But behind that wave, I would say inevitably, someone a few months ago challenged me, and they were sad. They said, Mark, why is it that we have no churches that are still existing, from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago? They're no longer there. I live an hour from Corinth, where the church of the Corinthians that Paul wrote to is there. I mean, it's ruins. There's no church there. And even in modern day Corinth, a couple of miles away, there's very little. Although, you know, there's certain types of Christianity there, but um, so that behind this wave, you see this sort of uh, the the very negative word. Sorry, I'll say that first, and then I'll try to spin it more positively. The negative word is rot. We end up rotting from the inside out, and eventually we just dissipate. It's no longer there, no longer has an impact in that society, and we need new revivals or new moves of God, new people to come in. It's like a new frontier almost. Okay. Now, so what's going on there? What's happening? And I think when we say there's been a lot of success, there has to some degree, but there's something about what we're leaving behind that isn't lasting. I'm not saying that across the board. There's many success stories, and we're the definition of successes in this isn't that we have, First Baptist Church of a city remains there for 1,000 years. That's not the kind of church we're talking about. We're talking about communities of God's people. And it's quite possible that the communities migrate or move away, and that church in name is no longer there. That doesn't mean that the people fell away. Okay. All of this is sort of intertwined, right? Because as we redefine what church is, it changes this very question, too. What is the definition of success in Christianity? So that's one thing to consider, that the frontiers are changing. And in a sense, the backfill, what's coming in behind as the wave passes, is not a new type of religion. It tends to be a type of secularism that is filling in. And the type of church in post-modernity and beyond, the type of church that is going to survive is not the type that we've been planting in the past. So times are changing. Another good book I'm reading, I can't remember the author's name at the moment, is talks about the fact that every 500 years there's some kind of a reformation that happens in Christianity, very roughly speaking. And we're in the middle of one of those right now at the sort of 2,000-year point. There's a need to reform, to re-understand and reimagine what church is, not to stray away from the New Testament, but to recommit to the principles of organic body, family, and church that are there right from the beginning, and then bring those into today's context and say, what does that look like in a way that is sustainable? So that's part of it. Another point, just a sort of a side point to add to this, is not in every case, but in many of the cases of where we've seen the church greatly expand and grow, and just phenomenal moves of the spirit in bringing people into the kingdom and gathering, have been in parts of the world where there was persecution, where there was not freedom, where the church could not exist in the form we've created it now. So we can celebrate the success of the church, but I think much of the success of the church was not due to our current understanding of church. It was in spite of it. And it was because of persecution, because people saw the stark contrast between the empire of the world and the kingdom of God. And they were willing to give their lives to the kingdom of God. And that was witness that spread. So I know that's a little bit of a deeper answer to that question. I think there are answers, and I admit I don't understand it all. I don't have all the answers, but I think there's a way of looking at it that does make perfect sense.
Yeah. I think if I could just add a comment to that, when I think about, you saying that the church kind of grew in spite of some of these things. I think maybe the challenge, as someone who's boots on the ground in a pastoral role, and people who are in leadership in the churches, we can say the church, kept going, the Lord will have his church and all of those things. But I think part of our responsibility is to try and find the most effective way, not just to have church because church looks this way and we like it or whatever, but I think it's our duty to try and find the most effective way, not just for ourselves, although that's great because I want to feel God's love and I want to be in community. I want to experience the Holy Spirit, and not just so that others can come to know Christ, but because I think that's what God deserves. I think that God is worthy to receive our best worship and our best praise, and I think that he is worthy for us to seek out the best way to have ecclesia and to have church. Those are just the thoughts off the top of my head. But Mark, any final comments before we wrap up today around leadership?
Yes, I did want to say just a couple of things. One is, we're not in this discussion, we're not trying to cover all the important elements in the discussion of leadership in churches. Okay, there's other important topics that need to be wrestled with. Okay, the point of this is not to sort of give you an overview of everything. We're picking 2 or 3 elements here that I think are significant enough that if we commit to addressing these, like open our minds up in prayer to some of these realities about what church is and what leadership looks like in an organic family context and so on, that it's going to set us on a path of discovery. Okay, so what I call them gateway principles. They're things that are going to lead you to wrestle with some of the other issues as well, but they create sort of a new context, a new attitude, a new culture about it. And the last thing I'll say is our goal, and I want to watch myself that I'm not giving people formulas. I don't want to give formulas. I don't want to write a how-to book. There isn't one way. There isn't one way. There are a few fundamental principles, and every culture and every nation and every generation is going to figure it out in a different way. Okay. So you can say, how do you do this and this and this? And I'm going to, I've got some thoughts, wrestle with that, but never take my word at face value. Go to scripture prayerfully and truly open yourself up. Ask yourself, are you in bondage to a way of thinking that is blinding you? Are you in bondage, dare I say, to a denomination or to a certain stream of Christianity that is blinding you to what Scripture is saying, to those deeper principles? And so if you're on a hunt to explore and learn, you've started, and that's fantastic. There's some really good books out there that are starting to explore some of this. But in real honesty, I read some of those books and find them very helpful. But in all honesty, if you simply take your New Testament and say, God, take away all this stuff that I've been conditioned with culturally, and I'm not saying all of that is bad. I'm saying just take those lenses off and start reading from beginning to end the New Testament, and ask yourself a couple of questions along this way. What is this saying about the nature of God? What is this saying about the nature of community? What is it saying about the nature of leadership? And just take little notes or highlight them in your Bible along the way. And when you let that word of God speak back to you, instead of you speaking into it, all of your preconceived sort of assumptions, let it speak to you. I think you're going to start to see an amazing, beautiful thing that God has in store for us that we've sort of boxed or organized ourselves out of, but we need to rediscover.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And thank you to everyone listening for joining us for the Mission Critical podcast. We would love it if you would consider leaving a review or subscribing or sharing this podcast with a friend. You can find us in all sorts of places, on Facebook, on Instagram, or on LinkedIn, or even on our website at lead555.com. Here at Lead 5, we help leaders tackle problems together, and we hope that our conversation today helped you to think deeply and move forward courageously in your leadership. Thank you so much for listening.